Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks for having me here. This topic that I'm going to talk about started several years ago when this institution was in the beginning stages, and Anutai was discussing with me about like their directions and their belief. And at that time, I thought, oh, not another music conservatory. And so I started sharing with her my experiences in the liberal arts education in America, where I studied and taught for some years. And so, especially when she talked about the context of Southeast Asia, and also how she wants to nurture talents in a particular way, and also because of her work in Silpakorn University that involved the other disciplines. So we started sharing a lot of different ideas. Last year I was supposed to come, but then I kind of like fall way out of it, and this year I guess I cannot escape. And I guess it's why I was trying to escape is because it's easy to kind of discuss like this with her, and it's very hard to kind of formalize into a statement for a paper presentation, I feel. So why is that so? So let me go through start my presentation, because you notice that even for my title, I kind of ended up with question marks because it's hard. I mean, as if you have been following Anutai's presentation all these years, you realize that, and also some of us, our colleagues, right, we have, as Asians who have gone abroad to study and coming back, we often inherited kind of a construct of what the world can be through the system of education and all that. And when you come back to our own country to try and introduce some of these ideas, immediately we find lots of tension like that with what we see on the ground. Sometimes, I mean, when we're in certain positions, like as vice president, you can kind of come in and install certain things in place. In a way, I had a chance of doing that when I started work in Singapore as the head of music in Raffles Institution and subsequently the head of the arts. I simply came in and I simply decided that it should be like this and like that. And of course, it is very much linked to also the institution's view. In Raffles Institution in Singapore, they don't call what they do liberal arts, but the way of thinking is actually very liberal arts in thinking, in the sense of their collaboration with other subjects, thinking across discipline, and going away from merely skill-based kind of content teaching to critical and thinking-based kind of approach, idea-based kind of approach. And also in the more recent years in our school, there's been a lot of emphasis on community involvement and engagement, how we have to be aware of our surroundings. And those of you who knows me coming from Singapore, today is our election day. Some of these topics, of course, there's a larger context if you've been following all the Facebook discussion. Our school being in a way branded as an elitist school, we have always been kind of put on spotlight with this question on how do the elite engage the other levels of society and the general population at large. So therefore, in that context, you can see how liberal arts is a useful, a convenient label to justify a lot of things that we do. And then riding on perhaps an American history of implementing that and the ideals that's attached to liberal arts education, as if it is already a proven strategy. it becomes convenient, I guess, for institutions to throw that words around. But then on the ground, when you have to implement it, immediately you realize that there's lots of issues, both as administrator and also for myself as a composer, artist, and also teacher. How do we bend, fit certain traditions and contents that we have inherited within a Western form of pedagogy, system assessment, and then still hope that at the end of all that fitting, we still retain some essence of what we sought to inherit in the first place. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Okay, so let me give you what is already the given. Oops. All right, so this I think I'm sure everybody knows. I mean, another reason why I hesitate to give this talk is because I thought that, oh, it's such a common knowledge, shouldn't everybody already know this? I mean, liberal arts simply means doing everything else except your own major kind of focus. Of course, it's with the context that a lot of people put it up as general education, okay, as opposed to vocational kind of training. I guess it came out also of us being a former British colony, and so how we inherited a British kind of education system whereby once you enter university, you immediately major in a certain subject. And I went to UK for my undergraduate, and only when I went to US for my graduate studies that I started to realize that, oh, I didn't have that broad-based kind of training, which I assume I had, having done A-levels, but it's not quite the same. Oops. So again, this is something that I just talked about. I mean, this whole idea of training as a whole person, liberal arts as foundation for holistic education, whatever that means, multidisciplinary thinking. You can see these buzzwords has been floating around in education, and what does it actually mean to connect back to our local roots? I think that's the very, very difficult thing to talk about in at least at this stage, and especially putting me on the last day is especially hard because having heard so many experts talk about their various areas, I feel like I'm still in the stage of trying to assimilate a lot of different ideas. I've been jotting down tons and tons of notes, and at the same time I've been changing my slides over and over again and fitting things that I just learned more recently into the sequence of things. And as you can see, it is in a way a work in progress, but nevertheless, since I'm here, I'll share some of my more recent kind of thinking on this subject, and then hopefully later on you will see, especially through my colleagues' next presentation on musicology, which is a more specific area within this larger scope of music training. How in our school we do certain things to kind of incorporate some of these trajectories and ideas. Okay. So first of all, since we all have this general understanding of liberal arts, next thing on my equation is the state of ASEAN classical music, right? I put classical in brackets because of how over the days we have been hearing a lot of different definitions, which I'm not going to that. I think all of you have different ideas, and you know that some of these definitions are still in a way open-ended. So it's very good that in this conference a lot of us talk about a definition, and a lot of us also acknowledge the process of trying to define what classical can mean. And I find that the defining process, I mean, notice I use the continuous tense because I find that this process is important that we keep going, although we may never arrive at a real definition, we may not really need a real definition. I think through the defining process, we actually come to understand ourselves better. I mean, it's almost, the defining process is almost like a mirror to me, mirror to allow us to see ourselves. Okay, I think the next area that we need to look at is really the concretely, the level and scope of social engagement with regards to ASEAN classical music. How is that music relevant to our students or to the younger generation? How is it even relevant to us, my generation, or to my parents' generation even now? So these are some of the very personal questions that I'm thinking about, because I grew up with street operas in the car parks and throughout the year with different kind of festivals, and now there's none. Yeah, and so and do we miss it? Do my parents miss it? Right? Because so that's also the level of talking about relevance that I'm concerned with. Meaning, who knows and who cares? Who actually know what our tradition is anymore? And by knowing is also a very dangerous word. I mean, knowing it in what kind of context? Because, like I said, I mean, a lot of generation of us went abroad to study. I studied ethnomusicology when I was in King's. We had courses in ethnomusicology in SOA, School of Oriental and African Studies, and we thought that a lot of things we learned about, let's say, African music, Indian music, Chinese music were the way to know this music. And then, of course, coming home, you get your root shock again. Because I guess on a very personal level as well as intellectual level, because on a personal level, you come back with a degree and you think that, well, you have that certification to know this thing, right? And then when you meet people on the ground, that's when you realize that, oh, their construct or their ideas are quite different from ours. Their system of talking about things are quite different from my understanding. And so there are two reactions to that. One, for us as an artist, is to run away from it. Like, okay, forget about it, who cares, right? Because I'm not in that field, I'm a composer, yeah, in a way, I can put it that way. But on the other hand, being a teacher at the same time, I guess we got to care. And also, as we start to compose more within our local context, I feel like we have no choice but to care. Because I cannot imagine how to compose the way that I composed when I was in the States or in London when I'm back home. The sound world is different, the people are different, the response to music is different. We can, of course, again, take that who cares attitude and set up our own concert and present it within a confined space and invite friends to come, friends who will support you either personally or at least musically. But then, how is that relevant even to the rest of the population? What do they think of it? And true enough, there are people who then come and tell you, especially your students, like, why do that? What is the meaning of it? And they will start to see you as being strange, and you start to feel alienated. So these are some of the things that I went through on a personal level. Yeah. So therefore, as an educator, you start to wonder, like, okay, should I be more active in trying to explain? Then you come to this issue of like, how does one even begin to explain, right? Do I use the Western model and say, this is how I see it, this is how I learn it, and you should too, because I'm going to test you on that based on this system of thinking on the subject? Or should I expose you in a very passive manner, in a soft manner, into my experiences, and perhaps you will come to believe what I believe and see things the way I see things. And you often find that, and in a very interesting manner, the students often come up with very surprising take. Even though you may share with them the music you listen to, the books that you read, the movies that you have watched, they might react to them very, very differently, and rightly so. And the variety is always interesting, and that's another reason why sometimes creatively as a person, I find it more inspiring to teach than to compose because of this level of engagement. Because I see my students as my audience in many ways, and when I throw things out to them, the reactions that they give me is a lot more exciting than when I present a piece at a concert. When there's often too much, especially in Asian context, too much politeness and oh, well done, interesting piece, and then the conversation stops there, yeah. So I wanted to talk about the state of ASEAN classical music by, again, this is me dodging the issue yet again, by looking at architecture. Because I mean, one do see how architecture is in a way a parallel to music, at least that's the way I'm seeing it, basically constructs in space and time. A presentation of things in space and time. And just a few days ago, we went to this Swan Pakar Palace, and I was struck by a few things. Look at this photo. Look at the scale of the building, and look at the huge structure behind that. And it got me thinking, like, how isn't this the state of our classical ASEAN music right now? That we are, in a way, in a very nice little area of our own, but we are constantly feeling encroached in by modernity. And this modernity is often quite brutal, I would say. And look at the gray and the color, the gray of the structure and the color of the traditional building. But at the same time, I think that one also see ingenuity. One also see ways of recreating tradition and not seeing tradition as a monolithic idea. For example, if you look at the building on the right, we were told by the guide that it's actually a house that the prince brought back for his wife. Is from Ayutthaya. And it's actually a merging of two houses. He found these two kind of, I think they're palace, or they are a palace building or temple building, and there's actually one house within this larger house, and because they are in quite bad states of condition, and so in order to salvage the two houses, he decided to combine both into one. So if you enter the house, you can actually see one chamber within another larger chamber. And I thought that, well, that's a very interesting creative renewal of something that is traditional. And what struck me was really the love of it, the passion for preserving and then representing something that is old. So despite that stark contrast, one do see how within the confines there is love. Oh, the other thing that I was very struck by is how the naming of the place, as Swan Pakar was told that it is because this ground was originally a cabbage patch garden and all that, and I thought that the mixture of register is kind of interesting with the low and the high, of how a farm is kind of like named as a palace at the same time, right? So in a way, when we kind of learned about postmodernism and modernism and ideas like that from the West, you find that, oh, some of these ideas were not so alien or not so remote in our even more recent past. that these ideas were perhaps also universal, but except that maybe the chronological order might be quite different. So therefore, again, I think that using, I guess, kind of transference of ideas and knowledge that we always practice in liberal arts thinking, right? How if we drop the name, drop certain aspects of a name, like modern and postmodernism, the aspects of, especially the chronological aspects of it, the idea itself sometimes can be applicable across culture. Maybe that's just one insight that I got from looking at this. All right, the next one is, of course, the Cookridge House in Satong. And I mention Satong because, Satong is such a modernized commercial district in Bangkok. And again, one sees these towering structures behind, they are really surrounding all these traditional buildings, all this complex of building. And if you notice this is kind of red brick and it kind of blends in, but then this is actually a lift that is built by Cookridge after he was unable to walk and he needed to be on a wheelchair and yet access his house. So he actually had to build a 2-story lift to the house. So I thought, oh, okay, so is that lesson for us to learn about how we can kind of modernize within a classical context? And then when I look more carefully at the modern building, and I was thinking, do they really threaten classical heritage by being built so close and so tall and so prominently around them? Or do they in a way set up a very interesting dialogue between what is traditional and what is new? In a way, when I talk about just now the love, right, how the prince recombined the two houses, in this way, is this a modern way, a Western modern way of acknowledging the past? Look at the roof structure of these two buildings. I think that whole response is quite valuable, and it's a value that I guess as an educator I would like to instill in my students in a way of respecting and also in a way of corresponding with their own past tradition. So in a way, we can really see two sides to every situation. This is a panoramic view of the Swan Pakat Palace. And in addition to this BTS track, you also see similarly other tall buildings around it. And so one could actually see that, translate this as classicism, traditions, fighting the encroachment, and in that fight we are isolated. But those of us who are musicians, you find that those who are dealing with like new music or contemporary music, you find that constantly we are in that position, right? We're always fighting. Oh, we need to do this, and we all set ourselves up in this kind of contest with mainstream music, with classical music, with pop music, so to speak. And in that fight, we have isolated ourselves, right? And at the same time, we also feel very lonely in our irrelevance. Like how when we share the music we write and we listen to with our students, we often feel like, oh, I'm the only person who believes in this or really respond to this. But at the same time, so this you can see as maybe active, you can see as maybe negative. The statements on top as it can be escapism. All right, we often see how that we have this group of friends like Anutai and me, and then we always, when we talk about contemporary art, it's like, oh yeah, that's right. We're so happy to find each other in that way. So in a way, when we meet, it's an oasis of calm, right? I mean, but are we escaping into that calm occasionally? Then when we talk, because I also learned the guqin, which is a 7-string zither. And when I play the instrument, I always feel like, oh, I somehow connect back to my past in a, maybe I should admit, a romantic way. And that comfort, is that what we want? Is that what we sought after? So constantly we are having all these kind of dichotomies, and we're always trying to balance that. Western, Eastern, liberal arts, as opposed to vocational, classical as opposed to experimental, in the sense of how, like last night's concert, for example, something that is authentic, which I oppose it with postmodern in the sense of how I see it as within a modernist context, one can define classicism, authenticity very well, but then once we go into the postmodern thinking, these definitions and concepts become actually quite meaningless and quite without any function. Yeah. And so what can we do with all these dichotomies? I think all the time the tension is always dealing with these and trying to say, oh, how much of it is this and how much of it is that, and also trying to reconcile within ourselves that, oh, I'm doing both. Or sometimes with certain friends I'll say, oh, I'm more experimental. With certain friends I'll say, oh, I'm actually more classical, and then we take different sides as well. But what I'm trying to propose today is that could this dichotomy become synthesis? Should we take a synthetic approach rather than a dichotomy approach? So this was like what happened the week, 2 weeks before we came here, and that in a way it's a student trip to Bali, a cultural tour for my students, but it was very striking to me. It kind of like changed my whole idea about what we can do. My initial aim was to bring the students to see one of the rare, in a way, quite authentic surviving culture in Southeast Asia, to see at all levels in their community living, in their village, festivals and all that. And then also at the same time, we are all well aware of encroaching modernism, tourism, and everything else. And then we were curious to study how they dealt with that. And never did I know that that what I experienced actually changed a lot of my position and thinking. And so that's why within this week again, my ideas for this presentation have taken a new turn. But you can see what is really striking is the balance of preservation and renewal, right? You can take it as another dichotomy, but I'm going to talk about it as a way of synthesis. And also, more importantly, their practice, their culture of a really living tradition. And I don't take it in a more cliche way of like, oh, living as in like, oh, it's still functioning. But I take it as what is the human agent in this functioning on a very, very personal level. Okay, first we met two dancers, Anom Baris and Park Chatra. One is a mass dancer and one is a Baris dancer. And in their talk about dance and about the artist's position, I talk about this human agent, right? What was striking was about this idea of this living being. That's every one of us, yeah? In our daily lives, all right, we receive stimulus around us through our five senses, and they call that energy, what we receive, what we see, what we hear, what we eat, and all that, what we feel. And you can see in this context of traditional artists or classical arts artists living in the modern world, the encroachment is all around. You just lift your head and you see all that, right? And how does one then absorb this energy, internalize it, deal with it, and then of course, you can't hold it in. I guess a lot of my personal issue has been trying to hold it in, struggle, and things like that. And I'm not sure if that is a very, to me, a very Western kind of trained inheritance that I received through my Western education, that is always this idea of a struggling artist, and one has to reconcile and has to work through all these differences, has to resist, like Dieter's paper quoting Adorno, right? The attitude of resistance. But the Balinese took it very differently. They say that, no, you can't hold it in, you'll get sick. And true enough, I think that there is a certain level of sickness in all of us, because we, especially us who have gone to the West and come back, it's always very difficult. And then he says that, no, it's important that you release it. So how does one release it? And so that's where, to me, the artistic living function, that's where it lies. How does one artistically do this and release it? Undo the tension and release it, yeah? And of course, you put it in a Western context and say, oh yeah, self-expression. Oh, we express our angst, we express our dissatisfaction, we express our, what's the word that you use? Against the hegemony, the fight, right? Resistance again, yes, resistance against that. Yeah, so does it come out necessarily that way? And is that the art that we want, or is that the next phase in this tradition that we have inherited? Okay, so concretely, the dancer in his, I mean, these are all like exact quotes from these people, right? So talk about how the dancer pulling out energy from his feet in his stance on the ground, and then transmitting the energy up. And he talks in a way like a qigong kind of thing, up to the dantian. And then through his hands and through his eyes, he actually projects out the energy into the audience as a way of expression. Interesting. I mean, all dancers, I guess, feel some kind of that. And I feel that somehow, is that a way of just presenting an art form, or is that a possible way of living as a person in an artistic manner? So, oops, I realized that my time is. So therefore, I came to the insight that perhaps the living being is both about, especially as an artist, is both about the art that we do as a stage art, as well as also a life we lived. How does one live as an artist? I think that struck me as very, very important and influential kind of idea that I received in my 2 weeks in Bali. Okay, then we met these international architects where he talks about idea. He talks about how, to him, idea comes first even before engineering. And at first I thought, oh, that's nothing new as well, because we always start thinking in school, and therefore ideas. But then he linked it to how the idea should drive the process, and in a way it's a good balance against how we see our definition of classical art. We often see as an end product, like it is in this form. And we often forget that this form is basically the end product, and we arrive at that through a certain living process. So that was what, and therefore he talks about process as journey rather than art as a product. And so then next we saw example of living examples. These are houses. I'm going to show you 2 houses. One is really the house of Prince of Uber. We were lucky to be invited to his house. He built this kind of model on the original Ubud Palace, Of course, with much expansion and all that. And you can see how this is very often how we deal with classicism in a Southeast Asian context, isn't it? Like we often take the best of traditions and put them together, and then we present that as really the high classical form in that sense. And you can see the whole space of it. And then next, we visited Warren Yudani's house, Balinese contemporary music composer, and it's also designed by Yokosara, the international architect. And you can see that his original idea was this little village hut, and he kind of joined them out with this curving roof, which is quite a modern feature, because we went with a Balinese priest to visit him, and he was actually quite shocked, and because he is a village priest, and so he knows about building and things like that, and he says that, it's so hard to build this curved structure. So you can see how traditional thinking marrying modern technology and modern thinking can come up with also hybrids like that, which to me is also another way of one processing traditional ideas and our inheritance in a self-expressive manner, I guess. And here you can see more of that. And one thing very interesting, because when we entered the house and the students started asking him, like, so what's so traditional about house, especially after seeing the Ubud's Prince house, right? He says, look at how the sun, because at the time it was late afternoon, the setting and how the sun rises, and he's talking about the house orientation and position, and that was true enough, one of those very fundamental Balinese thinking, because we had a lecture about this Trihita Karana thing, and then they talk about the man's relationship to environment. And so I guess in that way, to me, it is always, it speaks to me in a Chinese way when we talk about 天地 and 人, when we talk about how human as the agent harmonizing the heaven and the earth. And so in that sense, this harmonizing I actually see as an artistic movement, artistic function of a human being. Okay. So in a way, I come out of it thinking that art is not quite a profession that we get training in. Art is not really about perfection in the way that I'm seeing all these. Because of the emphasis on process. Art is not really about quality control, but about this process of searching and continuously redefining or finding a definition for something. And definitely art cannot be about classicism. In fact, for the Balinese, but again and again from different people, from the modern architecture, from traditional Ubud prints, is that art is more of a belief and a dedication. That's how they choose to live. And so therefore I'm seeing it as a living practice, and maybe we should even drop the word practice. Yeah, so then, of course, then we went on to look at the function of art and its influence and in other areas, and it leads to this lecture on Ramayana, and then they talk about how art can be inspiration for leadership as well. And this is incidentally slides that I found on the internet, and this was a paper presented actually at Slepakon in 2005 on a conference in Sanskrit. And they analyze Ramayana and trying to draw lessons on leadership out from that. And those underlying words are very interesting, because you find that again these buzzwords in education policies everywhere, right? Like lifelong learners, for example, ability to deal with complexity, ambiguity, uncertainty. And indeed, when we look at liberal arts education, isn't that in all universities that have general education, that have elective program, they always use that kind of statement to justify what they do. So, is that something Western, or is that a Western construct that is projected onto Ramayana, or is that inherently in Ramayana? So to me, I guess in the Asian versions of liberal arts, context would be something that is tied to the environment, the social community. I mean, these are the kind of really the major concerns that I have, and how we deal with the Western modernism and postmodernism. And I don't mean this as a final statement kind of thing, because, like I say, I mean, I have no idea. And therefore, classical music, we always see that it needs renewal. I think all the orchestral managers have been talking about that for ages. How do we reprogram our concerts? Why do we need renewal? I guess the more important thing is to regain its authenticity. And what's authenticity after that talk by Dieter? And the way ahead is really seeing music education as both vocational and technical as well as liberal arts. In fact, some ideas came out that were very interesting about how maybe a pianist should learn about piano technology, seeing how traditional instrumentalists usually build their own instruments. They know the functioning, they know the working of the instruments. And also, even after Prof. Chan's talk yesterday on Yong Siu Tu's direction of working, training students not necessarily to become just musicians, but working in another field. And I think that idea kind of fit into my current thinking of how, in a way, everybody should be an artist. Because that's about the only way that one can reconcile and digest and release all these very quintessential Southeast Asian or Asian dichotomies that is in us. So then, instead of talking about lifelong learners, I think that I want to talk about lifelong practitioners. Yeah, that's it, I think. Oh no. Yeah, because then after that I thought, because I run through this with my colleagues, she said, oh, you talk about so much general things, what are specific? I feel that, again, I'm trying to also build a segue into what she's going to present, and the kind of work that we've both been doing in our school. We feel that living arts really needs a culture. And what's a culture really? Which needs an environment, a space, which also include people. So you can see the three Hita Karana kind of things start to come in as well, that resonates, the whole relationship with people, with our surroundings. An institution that do what? That is doing what this conference does in a way, to exchange ideas, to spar, to redefine meanings, within which we can allow individuals to grow in art. And notice when I say grow in arts, not necessarily like making artwork, but really the art in ourselves, in the living, yeah? Where art is not just limited to art forms, but the artistic can be found in every activity. And in fact, in the industries, I mean, because having brought our student tours abroad, like to China and to Hong Kong, and visiting companies and all that, a lot of the HR people, I do not know why, keep telling me that, oh wow, you're an art teacher and then you're bringing students to the commercial establishments, institutions, and so they say, oh yeah, we are looking for students with artistic thinking. And that's coming from people from the commercial world. And I thought that, oh, somehow it resonates with what I'm thinking now, that maybe what artists can do is really to share this artistic being with everybody else. Yeah. So vocational and holistic liberal arts need not be a dichotomy, but it can be really merged in living as in practice. I hope finally this is done. And therefore, culture and it's really a collective artwork. I mean, sometimes as an artist, I always look back and say, what have I achieved as an artist over the last few years? And I like to think that what we built up within our little environment in school can be a collective artwork in itself. And this work is continuous. And therefore, my question mark is translated into ... Because in a way, we have not found one single path, although some of you whom I've spoken to here, I've been asking, so what did you do to solve this problem? What's your strategy there? And we find that there are many, many different solutions, and in a way, we really have no path ahead, but only the walking. And so I would encourage everyone to do the walking. Thank you very much.
Thank you for freeing the 3 hooks, and then we have the dots to walk. Thank you. So any comments or anything to share together? Thank you.
I really like this presentation because it takes us back to some very elemental things about being an artist, if indeed you think that musicians, for instance, are artists rather than scientists or anything. You can construe them as being. But there's one word you're avoiding here, which our generation avoids, and that is the word avocation. Because the opposite of a vocation is an avocation in traditional use, Victorian era use of English. And to put it very bluntly, the avocation has these days become the profession. And so the vocation becomes a profession, and the avocation becomes this kind of liberal thing, the deep down thing that you are, or you feel something is calling you to it. It may be your religious belief, it may be your fundamental belief in art. And I always think it's such a pity we don't use that word of avocation, because it directly defines the dualism. And it's defining it in terms of the voc bit in both the words, which is the Latin word to call. And I just suggest that because just as we don't so much now in American-influenced English use the word vocational, that's much more British English. We use the word professional.
Yes.
Being professional is like being an engineer and a lawyer, and it's something useful in society. While all the useless things, the ones that are much more important, we don't really have a nice word. You're searching for it here. You use liberal sometimes. You talk about a state of being, and in a way, that's what an avocation is. It is the state of being because something has caused you to feel you need to go there. It's just a suggestion. It's inadequacy in the way and lack of symmetry in the way in which we use words.
Yes, I agree in some ways, but it's hard when you, again, right, so much is tied to the language itself, and as you have explained, the historical context for that particular word as well. And the more we use words like this, the more we fall into, I guess, the construct somehow. I mean, I don't mean that, like I present with those photos of the traditional houses, right? I mean, we can see it both ways. I mean, very often we sometimes feel like we are trapped, and sometimes I like to think that it need not be a trap at all. Like we were sharing about how our education system is very much inherited from the Western model, and then we often feel very justified because it's kind of, in a way, been tried and tested. And then our traditional model of this guru relationship, does it even work with our modern economy or not? I mean, what can we learn from there? And so I think that, again, I'm asking questions. And I think that that constant asking is more important than arriving at a certain feeling of being trapped or being in a position to. And so yeah, I mean, sorry, a very aggressive response to your suggestion. I am trying very hard. You can see that I'm trying. I did not just leave out one word. I leave out a lot of words, and I kept changing the words because when I put out certain words, it means so many things to so many different people. And I like to think that what do we have to show then? And I like to think that it's again a collective work with my colleagues back in school, like what we can build, and then we can show through that, and then we can talk about all these afterwards. So in a way, why I avoided unadvertised invitations is because I feel that on some level it is premature to even address this, at least on a personal level, yeah.
Question, maybe you can address the issue of education a bit more specifically. I like that you added here with some Luigi by the way.
Yes, I know the, yeah.
But I'm curious, one of the things that one of the things that I've come to really believe in, maybe I didn't say that, when I'm working with students, is people say, well, how is it that you're really teaching music? Actually, it's quite simple. You play music with them, and you write music with them, and you listen to music with them, and you talk about music with them. And that's really it. But you have to have a space, essentially, for that communication to happen.
Exactly.
And well, I don't know if it's a Western model or what kind of model it is, but it's not the state of education mostly today. You speak of useless, or the useful and useless. I'll talk about the inefficient and the efficient. And education is incredible. Good education is incredibly inefficient. So
inefficient, and if you have an end product goal in mind, then you can measure the efficiency, right?
3 times a week, you get 500 people there. I mean, this is kind of, well, I say it's kind of extreme, but it's actually quite commonplace now. And now I've delivered you knowledge, and now you have consumed knowledge, and now you are knowledgeable, and I will test it.
No, correct. That's why if you hold that idea.
If you want to have the inefficient version, it's like, okay, I need to have classes with 10 people, we make some music together, we need to meet 6 hours a week. You need to pay some experts 6 hours of work a week so that they can meet with 10 kids, and it's highly inefficient. So now my question is, how have you begun to implement this in your own teaching inside the framework that you have to exist, that you have to exist in?
Well, some of the things we do is like, we try to create the environment like you say, and we try to teach the skills across different activities, like the understanding of music in performance, in composition, in study of music, for example. And because these are very much siloed within its curriculum time, right? So instead of, and then somebody mentioned the spiraling technique approach to education, we try to adopt some of these. It's not ideal, because students still have that mentality of switching on and switching off when it goes from one class to when they go from one class to another class, and so sometimes they don't see the connection. And of course, ideally, perhaps the guru model works very well. This whole total immersive process, and it's not just about learning the art practice itself, but learning to first live like an artist with an artist. How one wakes up, cook, the attitude you hold in the morning when you wake up and through the day, and in response to the community, to the people. And then when you start to make a sound, when you hold that mentality throughout the day, that sound is quite different, and it's unable, it's not possible to teach how to produce a sound like that without going through the process of living like that. And that is of course the way that I'm understanding this whole group student kind of system, how it works in terms of the learning to live artistically, yeah, and rather than to, because that's why as you were explaining, I was questioning, like because we're using words like inefficient and all that, because we have the end product model, and we have this modern economic model of measuring these things, right? I mean, on the other hand, big lecture groups are not something that is modern or Western even. I mean, as a Buddhist, when I think back of how all these sutras describing Buddha's always giving teaching, and it's always to thousands of people, and he alone talk like that. And so, is that inefficient? I'm not sure. And then what else do they learn in addition to that? I think it's that whole living and walking with Buddha in that sense. I mean, then again, I mean, you put in a Christian context of how Christ taught, right? I mean, they basically live together, right? I mean, the whole life is a pilgrimage in a way, right? So is that possible within a school context? Again, expanding on, I mean, bring back to what we have been doing, we feel that it's not enough. We feel that how we should then blur the boundary of schools and the society, the environment, like bringing our students out into the world with us to meet like composers like you guys, right? To hear, and they can observe how we relate to each other as I guess a model of how I'm kind of like unpacking the way that we are thinking and planning, right? But then in actual fact, it's basically, I'm trying to model on that whole guru practice, right? Of how one live with your teacher and then model yourself with your teacher in an artistic way of living. So that is the more, I guess, hidden and larger thing that I'm talking about here when I talk about environment and culture. Because then once you've got a community of people doing that, again going back to the Christ and his disciple, right, or Buddha and his disciples, right, then it becomes a way of life, a culture, right? Correct? I mean, when you look at the Sangha, the monk community, right, it's a way of life. It's a way of life. That's outside the more hegemonic Hindu caste system. Sorry?
What is that like?
Yeah, to me, if we drop the whole Western idea of arts, right? To me, that is the living part, and to me, that's what struck me very, very hard when I visited Bali and talking to those people. And all the time, I'm trying to distill art out of everything else they do, and all the time they're trying to put art into everything they do, including the way they eat, they present the food, and things like that. So, yeah. Okay, we should. Yes.
Still leading this discussion over lunch.
Thank you very much.
So thank you very much.